Over the past few years, there has been a large increase in the number of protests connected with the environment. On one hand, many of our farmers have been protesting as they feel that climate action could have a detrimental impact on their livelihoods. On the other hand, environmental activists feel that not enough action is being taken to reduce our shared impacts on climate change. Some will play these groups against each other as if their interests are not aligned. Ireland's particular type of farming system does come with a unique challenge in meeting climate change targets. But many have been left confused or misinformed about where the conflict really lies between Ireland's agricultural system and our climate change obligations. In this episode, we will explore the social, economic and environmental implications of Irish farming today and what new climate change targets could mean for Irish farmers. I was reared in a farming community where we grew our own food, and I've always felt a strong connection to rural Ireland and our farmers. Since I started learning about climate change over 30 years ago, I've been worried about all the ways that it will impact how we grow food around the world and here in Ireland. Farming has been a part of Ireland's heritage, culture, and the backbone of our economy for a long time. But how far back do Ireland's farming traditions really go? Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of the roots of Irish farming that goes back a very long time. To find out more, I'm at Douth in County Meath, where an archaeological dig run by Dr. Cliona Ní Líonóin is uncovering more secrets of our megalithic ancestors.
Tell us what's happening here.
We're on the site of the excavation of the Douth Hall passage tomb. This is a large passage tomb that was recently rediscovered.
And are you talking about a passage grave like Newgrange and Knowth and all of that, is it?
Yeah, very similar on a slightly smaller scale. This is our most beautifully decorated one.
Oh, wow.
If you look at these motifs here, they're really well carved and sort of lots of volume in the rings. And then if we look down here, they're really flat rings.
Start with the chisel, is it? Or
yeah,
some kind
so
of primitive
they would have either
stone
used
itself.
Quartz or antler or something stronger than the rock they're working in.
Okay, but they were very sophisticated though.
Definitely, these monuments show that they were architects, engineers, astronomers, master builders, and also when you look at the effort that would have gone into this, they were productive farmers, that they were able to support specialist workers and a larger community to actually spend time away from working on the farm to build these monuments.
Right, but with this you've moved from hunter-gatherers to actual farmers, cultivation of land, yeah? And how did they farm?
Initially when they came, they had mixed farming, so they would have had cattle, sheep and goat, pig. Dairying seems to have been quite important. And
they brought their cows with them?
Cows with them, yeah.
So we introduced the cows pretty early then in our cultivation, did we?
We've evidence from pottery in the Neolithic period that a lot of these pots were used to store dairy products, so probably milk, yoghurt, things like that.
Butter even? Possibly
butter, yeah. They also would have cultivated cereals, but throughout it all, cattle and probably dairy production seems to have been an important element.
Right, interesting. And of course it was mostly forest then, was it?
Yes, so they would have come to fairly heavily forested country. It doesn't seem to have been like a short, really intensive phase of clearance. It was sort of bit by bit, but it did have a big impact on the land. So like a lot of people look at sort of prehistory and say, oh, they did everything right there, but there were ecological implications for farming back then. You can analyse human remains to figure out what kind of diet they had. Early farmers here, it was all terrestrial based. Here it seems like they were definitely sort of meat and two veg and a lot of dairy.
It's astonishing to learn that the tradition of livestock farming in Ireland goes back to the beginnings of our civilization, well over 5,500 years. Maybe that goes some way to explaining why today Ireland has a higher percentage of land in agricultural use than any other country in Europe. And that most of that is dominated by grass pasture livestock farming, where the vast majority is in cattle for beef production. Coleman Cody is one of the 110,000 cattle farmers in Ireland. His family have been farming the land here in Kilcolman at the foot of the Slieve Blue Mountains for generations.
Yeah, are these all sucklers?
They're all suckler bred, a lot of them, yes.
Yeah. And roughly how many have you got?
Altogether it'd be about 100 animals.
100 cattle. So how long have you been farming?
I'm farming 40 odd year.
And if you take your sons too, are they interested in farming?
Yeah, they're very much interested.
Can they make a living out of farming like this?
They have to have a job with it.
They have to have a job with it.
Yes.
And are you in the same situation?
I'm in the same situation, yes.
So you can't, for example, with the 100 acres, you still have to have a job off the farm?
Yes, because the margins are so tight in cattle.
What are the expenditures?
Sure, as we say, we have feed, fertiliser.
What would that cost you, fertiliser?
Probably 10, 12,000 a year.
Right, so that's a big chunk.
You have machinery, insurance, do an odd new shed now and then to keep the thing going.
Yeah. Right, and if you take now all your income and all your expenditure, what is left to you?
About 22,000.
22,000. On a 100-acre farm, and you still can't make
a decent living.
No.
You're a busy fool. You're working, right, I start in the morning around 7:30 and I finish here around 8:30, 9 o'clock at night. When you do the maths on it, you have barely minimum wage. And you think every year it will get better, but it actually gets worse.
I can see the work you put in. I can see that your dedication to what you do and your commitment. But why is it that you can't make a living?
It's your cost is very high. That's the real reason. And we're not getting enough for the animals when we sell them. The customer wants cheap food. You take the factories, they have the animals for 2 to 3 weeks and they get a nice chunk of money out of your animal. You have them for 2.5 years and you can't hardly get the same money out of them.
So, I mean, the profits are being made by those that are exporting and whatever, is that it?
Yes.
In 2019, Board B valued Ireland's beef exports at over €2 billion. But even with billions more in agricultural supports, the average cattle farmer in Ireland earns less than the minimum wage while working on their farms.
Well, it seems very unfair.
We all know that. We know it for years.
And is there any way you could think of diversifying your farm to something else?
If I thought there was money in it, yes. If there was
certainty.
Certainty. I don't know where the future is. I'm hoping that things might improve. There's a love about farming. It's a healthy life. It is, it's nice to come down here and be working in silage and looking at animals and see them grow and see them develop, and that's a good one or that's a bad one, and there were good cattle that good calves that I bought. There's an enjoyment out of that end of the thing.
Sure, and the calving of them and everything, it's all very nice.
Cattle farmers like Coleman have been farming their land at low intensity for many centuries. In recent decades, they've been pushed to intensify production through increasing imported feed and fertiliser in order to increase outputs. But in that time, the profits in cattle farming have been gradually sliding down. Because Ireland is so specialised in livestock farming and moving more towards intensive practices, which often exacerbates environmental damage. Many environmentalists argue for diversification into different types of food production and return to a more mixed agricultural system. But is this viable? Tillage farming is something we used to do much more of. So why has that changed? Liam Lynham is a tillage farmer growing oats here in the Midlands, where the soil conditions and the Irish weather are most suitable.
So I see you've got oats already planted here.
Yes, so look, we're a mixed farming enterprise here, Duncan. As you can see across the way here, this is 2 fields of oats that we're growing on rotation, and we try and keep rotating the crops and rotating the fields around. And in other parts, we also have a small bit of forestry, and other parts of our land are not suitable for tillage, so that's kept in permanent grassland.
Right, so you've got quite a mixture.
Very, very traditional farming platform. It's something that would have been going on here for generations.
So this is your own now, this is your own produce.
This is our own product, Duncan, that we've launched in May of this year. And it's a huge growth market, Duncan. I think year on year, the market's growing 20. And then with the oat drink itself, it's exponentially outperforming all other plant-based drinks. In God's fresh air, the best place for it.
That's lovely.
This market has grown exponentially in the last 10 years. It still counts for less than 10% of dairy milk. People are still going to use dairy milk. Dairy milk is still a nutritious product. It's just that when you're doing your weekly shop, it's now going to be your dairy milk, your plant-based drinks, your juices.
Liam has taken a bold step to launch a new product in an effort to maintain the viability of his family tillage farm.
In terms of other farmers that are in tillage now, can they make a living out of tillage?
The reality, Duncan, is that economically, tillage farming is not viable at the moment. We're competing at animal feed price, which is the world commodity price. We're competing against world imports. Animal feeds, so soya, maize meal, whatever's on the global market. The tillage sector needs to move above that, because that's not profitable and it's not sustainable.
So what's the trend now with farmers locally?
The trends around here, either both locally and nationally, is that people are moving into dairy farming. And they're moving into dairy farming, they're moving out of beef, sheep and tillage farming because it's just not profitable, it's not sustainable. And if you're a young farmer starting up, your only real option to be a full-time farmer is to become a dairy farmer.
Right, now you've decided not to do that. Why is that?
Well, I suppose I'm no longer, one, I'm no longer a young farmer. Two, I'm looking for something different. I'm looking to focus on something alternative. And I suppose that's my mindset.
It's taking extraordinary efforts and bravery from Liam and his family to launch their own product that adds value to their farm. I wish them every success. But it's clear that tillage farming on its own doesn't currently offer a viable alternative for most of our cattle farming in Ireland, as most young farmers today are following the markets and pivoting to dairy. But what does Ireland's new climate change targets mean for this big picture going forward? Ireland's new Climate Act enshrines in law to reduce our total greenhouse gas emissions by 51% by 2030. With climate action finally on the government agenda, there's concern among Irish farmers that they will be disproportionately penalised.
We are being forced into a situation where we've been put out of business.
In anticipation of strict climate targets being set for agriculture, Ireland's largest farming lobby group has organised protest demonstrations around the country. I'm here in Roscommon to find out how these farmers feel about what might be coming.
It is a big worry, that they're going to go too far as regards climate change and not given enough support to get there.
These are all my friends from Tuam.
Oh, you're all from Tuam. My father went to school in St. Charles.
Yeah. What happened to you when you got to Dublin?
What
happened to you when you got to
Dublin?
Dublin?
Well, I know, yeah, of course.
You changed your colours a good bit, didn't you?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I come from a farming background in East Galway.
I don't know what you're doing either. So I don't.
So I know the problems. I was reared on a small farm, and I know your issues. But where do you see the solutions to this problem? How do you see the solution?
First and foremost, if they stop blaming us for climate change and things like that, and to think that they think that our flatulent cows or cattle are the cause of global warming, if they stop pointing the finger of blame, first and foremost, that would be a help.
Right,
Every single one of us are doing our best.
Yeah, I know.
You cannot ask us to give up our line of income where we feed and support and
this is
school
really
our
important
families.
because this is, in my view, fundamental. Just transition is very important.
I think most farmers and have shown the willingness down through the years in what we've done.
Well, our people are quite prepared in Europe to bring beef 5,000 miles across from Brazil, where they're knocking down the
it's all wrong.
rainforest.
Look,
yes,
look,
but don't be pointing the finger at us.
This is completely wrong, as you say, and we have to make sure that stops.
But there's another thing, Duncan, we don't like. People, and I'm not talking about you, people well-off men coming out with big cars, talking down to us as if we never even went to school. And we have to listen to so much of that. It's very annoying now.
Do you think I'm doing that?
A little bit, yeah. You weren't inclined to take on board what we were saying.
We went to Dublin and forestry earlier this year.
Shortly after these regional demonstrations, a sectoral target for Ireland's agriculture system was set by government, which was followed by even more demonstrations in Dublin. But what will these new targets really mean for Irish farmers? The intensification of livestock, particularly dairy, has come with a myriad of environmental problems. To get a clearer picture of the challenge that Ireland's farmers face, I'm heading down to dairy country, where I've arranged for two scientists to explain the problem right at the coalface.
Come.
Donald Sheehan is an intensive dairy farmer in Castlelyons, County Cork, who I've got to know as someone trying to farm an intensive dairy system while doing his best to reduce his environmental impact.
Now, by the way, we've invited a couple of scientists here today to talk about climate change. Would you be on for that?
Yeah.
Joining that conversation?
Mm-hmm. Bring them on.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Would you be on for that?
I would.
Yeah.
Dr. Hannah Daly and Dr. David Stiles are two scientists who've been working on the difficult problem of how our agriculture system impacts on our climate emissions.
Well, thanks, Hannah and David, for coming down with us here. And really, my big concern is how do we reconcile greenhouse gas emission reductions in Ireland to basically mitigate climate change?
Okay, we can look at where the emissions in 2019 come from, and the majority of our emissions are from the energy sector or from fossil fuels. That's 34 million tonnes in 2019. Now, Ireland is very kind of particular because we have a huge agriculture sector and we rely on beef and dairy, which produce methane and nitrous oxide, which are very potent greenhouse gases. So about a third of our greenhouse gases come from agriculture. And then we've got another about 5 million tonnes from cement, from industrial processes, from waste, things like that.
If we look here at the energy, 34 million tonnes, what does that comprise?
There's three main sectors. A lot of people think that these emissions mainly come from electricity generation, and they used to, but actually our electricity emissions are a small part of that, well, relatively small. But the main challenge there in fossil fuels and energy is in transport and heat, because both of these have been climbing. So while we have roadmaps for transport, heat and electricity, we know what we need to do, sustainable energy basically. Agriculture here is a big, big component of our emissions, and that's going to be a very big thing to tackle.
So David, you're an expert now in carbon emissions in agriculture. So what can we do with our agriculture sector? Where's the breakdown of our emissions in agriculture?
Well, most of the emissions from the agriculture sector come from cattle, from the beef and the dairy cattle. And it's essentially from the food they eat. So the cattle eat the grass and then they burp out methane after eating that grass.
David explained that the methane from Ireland's nearly 7 million cows and 3.5 million sheep are a bigger warming impact than all of Ireland's transport sector. On top of this, there are emissions from manure management and the spreading of nitrogen fertilisers.
What you're saying, David, if I'm right, is that all of this here, this is what we account for, which is 21 million tonnes, which is 1/3 of all our total greenhouse gas emissions. And it's really all about cattle, isn't it?
Exactly, that's right.
I mean, it's a massive amount of our emissions.
It is, and it's not the entire story of the total emissions from the agricultural sector.
Some of these emissions are offset by carbon being drawn down into grasslands and in trees and hedgerows. But about 10% of Ireland's grassland is drained peaty organic soil that's mostly used in livestock farming, which causes enormous additional emissions that currently aren't accounted for in our national inventory.
But we also have to import huge quantities of fertilisers and feeds annually into Ireland. And so those, if we count for the footprint of producing that fertiliser and that feed, then we add on another almost 10 million tonnes of CO2 to Ireland's greenhouse gas balance.
This is like soya coming from rainforest areas and everything.
Partly soya, partly maize, partly wheat, but also nitrogen fertilisers. They're very energy intensive to manufacture, so they've got very high embodied emissions.
So David, what I'm learning from what you're saying is that our emissions from agriculture are not just this amount here, the 21 million tonnes, but they're much, much bigger. And they're only being offset by this amount down here. So it's probably 50% higher than what we are accounting for at the moment.
That's right. We've got a huge amount of extra emissions from the drained organic soils and from the import of fertiliser and feed. Those emissions happen elsewhere, but they're part of our agricultural food system. And so if we account for all of them, we've got a much bigger job to try and reduce those emissions down.
It's going to be very difficult for farmers.
It will be.
And in fairness to farmers, they did what they were asked to do. Increase productivity, drain their land, put fertilisers on land, etc. So in a way, farmers only did what they were expected to do.
That's right, and Irish farmers are relatively quite efficient at producing milk and producing beef. And so it's very difficult to reduce those emissions without doing something about trying to reduce or move away from cattle production as a source of income for farmers.
The challenge this analysis reveals for our farming community seems overwhelming. But what does our dairy farmer think?
Donald, I mean, what do you think?
There are challenges, Duncan, but the way farmers' incomes are worked is that they're paid on what they produce. The more you produce, the more you get paid. There is no increment in the payment system where farmers are rewarded for looking after the environment. So naturally, the same as any other occupation, farmers will just do what the system is telling them, produce more and more and more. It's volume-based, it's a commodity, whereas really and truly, Ireland Ag should be sending out a message that we're able to do a awful lot more than that. We're able to give added value.
Like many farmers in Ireland, Donal is experiencing a dilemma between profitability and environmental impacts. He took me on a walk to show how he's trying to strike a balance on his farm.
Ultimately what has happened is we've put too much land into food production and we need to roll back a small bit, and farmers might find that hard to digest, but that's the road we were pushed down. That's the road that industry pushed us to produce commodity food at cheap prices. There has been damage to the environment, and that's why we have to roll back a small bit and start improving biodiversity and all the other facets of the environment.
In our next episode, we'll see what Ireland's farming system could look like if our agriculture policy was directed at supporting farmers to reduce their climate change impacts. And explore how we can move forward in a way that's economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable for our farming community.